So I think good morning, everybody. Let's get going. We're 2 minutes past the hour of 10. Whoever's now joining us will be let in. And obviously, welcome to everybody. A happy new year. Hopefully, it's a peaceful, prosperous, healthy, and happy 2024. I think we all know the kind of general rules of engagement. Uh, Try and keep your cameras off. Try and keep your um, sound off as well, simply to avoid background noise. That is not to disincentivize participation, which we obviously encourage and we would like. So please feel free to raise your hand if you have a comment, if you want to intervene, if you want to interject. And John, our lead presenter, doesn't mind at all if you do have a point to make while we're going, but let's just keep some order so we avoid disruptions. So if you indicate, you will then be unmuted or be allowed to unmute yourself. Switch on your camera briefly if you can, so we can see who it is that's talking. And then switch it off again just to save bandwidth. We will do the same, at least I will. John will keep it on for as long as possible. Every time I intervene as an interlocutor, I will switch my camera on, but to save bandwidth and so on, I'll switch it off. So that's the general house rules. Just to, and there's the chat, which is always going to be available. The chat will be available for you for making any kind of intervention, comment, critique, raise a point of question or anything of that sort. And so obviously, as you know, we welcome that interaction. You'll notice also in the chat that Chetza has put up a link with a question. And this is a real-time kind of poll. It is to solicit opinion, comment, and if you have an analytic point to make, to do so on the link that is in the chat. It is a polis type poll. The question is going to be posed in the chat. So please have a look. That link will be active throughout the day and beyond the period of the seminar. So when the recording and the link to the recording is sent out after this, it will be available there. Keep interacting with it. It will obviously help shape future discussions and interventions and so on. So before we continue for a moment, I've already said welcome to everybody. Thank you to the Defend Our Democracy for hosting the series. Thanks for John making himself available to lead this. As you're aware, this is our fourth in the series. But before we go on, we obviously are entering an election year. Everyone is talking about elections. We are not saying we are not political, but we're focusing on many of the deeper structural issues. We will touch on the politics inevitably, but we're interested in the deeper structural policy and other matters which must survive beyond the election, beyond the current debate that is taking place, and the focus on those minor issues. We're looking at much bigger structural issues for the potential success of our society. Before we go on, before I introduce John, who's going to lead our seminar, I'd like to take a moment of silence just to remember all of the loss of life over 2023, especially in the Middle East, in the Israel-Palestine or Israel-Hamas conflict, and take a moment just to ponder the matter that has been taken to the International Court of Justice by our country, South Africa. And so just for the mourning the loss of life in that area, in that region, tragic as it is, just to take a moment of silence before we go on. Thank you, everyone, and welcome again. Thank you, Defend Our Democracy. And thanks, John, for leading our seminar series. As you know, the theme and title, for those of you who received the invitation in the email, we're talking about global trends which can shape the success and prospect for not just stability, but for jobs in South Africa. What are these? And it's a continuation of the themes we've been talking about in the past three of the seminar series. Our leader on this is John Mattison. John, as you probably all well know, yeah, but just by way of brief introduction, is a very well-known journalist and commentator who has acted as editor at times of high-profile publications. He's worked internationally for the UN, has worked locally. Of course, the one claim to fame that may not be very widely known is that John prepared President Mandela for dealing with the media once he came out of prison and so on. As John has had a long involvement in public affairs, both South Africa and internationally, working variously with the UN and other places, including in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. But largely focused on South Africa, spent quite a bit of time at the University of Chicago looking at the question of development and comparative development on a fellowship. So he's well placed, other than his genuine thinking about the evolution of South Africa, of South African democracy and South African development, having spent time at the US, having time in space at the University of Chicago to think about developmental states, particularly in comparative perspective, I think is very well placed to lead our seminar. John, over to you. As everyone knows, we welcome interaction. Feel free to do so in the chat, but also to raise your hand and we will allow you to unmute and make your comment. Thank you, everyone. John, over to you.
Thanks, Abraham, and good morning, everyone. I'm talking to you from Franschhoek, which is scorchingly hot. I've switched off my fan because I think I'm trying to do it without the noise, but I might have to switch it on if it gets unbearable. As you know, in the last episodes, we talked about how you can get rapid growth in South Africa, and I'm absolutely convinced you can. And there are models to follow, including in Africa. But what I wanted to do with this one is to look at why didn't our constitution stop the collapse in things like our electricity supply, our rail networks, harbors, criminal justice system, defense force, so many places. We've now had 30 years to test the design and see the flaws that may not have been anticipated at Cadessa, given that democracy was an entirely new solution for South Africa. Today, I want to discuss a small number of important reforms needed to get South Africa functioning effectively again, so we can finally solve the problem of youth unemployment and other core issues. I'm going to talk about the Constitution second, but I want to start with cabinet government because we don't talk much about that. But cabinet is where service delivery accountability resides. And I've noticed certain practices that are based on conventions that evolve over time. Some are unwritten and some are practices that may even conflict with what's written down but become routine. And I think this is the time, given that we're facing election this year and everybody's rethinking and recognizing that we can't go on as we did before, that we've got to rethink these things and look at. I will try and describe the minimum number of things that are essential, because there's always the danger when you talk about change, including constitutional change, that more and more people come in and say, what about this and what about that? And I think the Constitution should be changed sparingly, and even these cabinet conventions that we want to discuss as well, likewise. So at the cabinet level of government, much of how things are done is based on conventions that evolve over time. And clearly, our executive isn't getting the job done. I don't think anyone can dispute that now. We've now had stagnation, economic stagnation for 16 years. And we've had severe breakdowns, electricity, railways, harbors, municipalities, criminal justice, defense force. That's a pretty comprehensive list. And none of these should be acceptable. They should have been resolved by an effectively designed constitutional democracy. So what went wrong? The legislature and judiciary should hold the executive accountable when it falls short through the separation of powers. The Chapter 9 bodies are independent, so they can hold the executive accountable for service delivery. And a free press has ensured we have a very aggressive media with outstanding investigative journalists that have uncovered most of the big cases of egregious failure. But things haven't been fixed. We could blame the ruling party or individuals, but politicians, but the purpose here is to look deeper at what institutional failures need to be corrected. Once something seriously wrong is brought out through the media and the judiciary, up to the executive, headed by the cabinet to act, and that hasn't happened. So why? So one part of the answer is a breakdown of joint cabinet responsibility. Joint cabinet responsibility is something I think we all took for granted. But look at the obvious case where this has failed, but it's failed in more than one place, is look at the cabinet on electricity. The divisions between Gwede Mantashe as the mining and energy minister and the electricity minister over coal versus renewables like solar and wind is dysfunctional. Until you face up to that, you're not going to fix the problem. Just the latest official integrated resource plan that came about 10 days ago for electricity differs from what government has been saying up to that. They'd cut back on renewable electricity than was government policy. It should be obvious to all of us that this costs jobs and it costs electricity, which can mean lives. There are billions of rands available to invest in electricity generation through solar and wind. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean you must take it all, but the policy says we should be taking more. But in fact, less will be taken as a result of the latest IRP. The end of load shedding will be slowed down, and the IRP is just one example. So why is it allowed to happen? Part of the answer is that cabinet is not united, and ministers don't share joint cabinet responsibility in practice. But of course, Gwede Mantashe is both Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy and chairperson of the ANC, which seems to give him the power to block government policy. How should it be reformed by the next government? It seems obvious that the first thing to do is to make a single minister responsible for Eskom, energy, electricity, as well as mining, since mining is so tightly interlinked. I don't know a country in the world where three ministers can veto each other and do on electricity policy. Remember, the third minister is Pravin Gordhan, who as Minister of Public Enterprises in charge of Eskom. Then there's also a fourth minister, the finance minister, who has an effective veto of some policies. And I think that's unavoidable, but there are better ways to handle it. And of course, there's an electricity operation in the presidency, which is expanding. We'll come back to that later. So the second is that we must return to the custom of joint cabinet responsibility. In other words, cabinet is where differences are fought out vigorously. But after that, the entire cabinet must speak and act with a single voice. In both one-party states and democracies, the president is likely to demand action and see it through to a successful resolution. Where the president is slow to act, other ministers will ask probing questions in cabinet. If that ever fails, the president, as head of cabinet, should step in, meet the conflicting parties, settle the matter, and not leave the room without an assurance from all present that they leave the room speaking with one voice. It might sound like a small thing, but it's actually vital. It's really key to the root cause of the failure. In mature democracies, cabinet ministers are likely to have had years in parliament debating and voting on all the affairs of government, so they have long-term knowledge of other sectors besides their own. They also have, other than the US, where the executive is not in the legislature, but in the UK and most other places, the cabinet are also members of the legislature of parliament, and they're expected to hold report back meetings to their constituencies, as well as surgeries, as they call them in the UK, where they meet any voter who walks in the door with a service delivery problem and follow it up back in London. In the US, every Congress, I lived in Washington for 6 years. In Washington, every congressperson and senator has at least one constituency office back home with full-time staff. And again, individual constituents can walk in the door and complain about everything from visas to service delivery breakdowns. It's followed up with the government with the clout of the elected congressperson who will call the official responsible in Washington personally and threaten to hold hearings and summon that official to explain themselves and account for themselves in public. None of these systems work perfectly. My colleagues remind me that if you come to Washington or Westminster, it's possible to get away with not doing your job. But there are real pressures back home. An MP or congressperson knows she or he risks being turfed out at the next election by the local voters. So MPs bring these issues to the attention of the executive at the working level first, but then they escalate to the minister herself if the problem isn't solved. The minister is expected to get it done, and the president or prime minister should expect to be kept abreast of progress, especially on the very big issues we're talking about now with electricity and rail and all of that. The prime minister or president needs to take special interest, get regular reports, because this will affect her or his re-election prospects. That hasn't happened here, we're now in the 16th year of load shedding and the 25th year since ESCOM went to government requesting new generation plants and were turned down. What should happen? Well, an informed press and opposition did bring it to public attention, but the overwhelming one-party dominance at the time allowed the ruling party to be unresponsive. What happened in cabinet? Could anyone stand up to the president whose decision it was? Whatever the case is, nothing changed. But then in 2008, when load shedding began, again, little change. State capture continued for another 9 years with more looting from ESCOM. And the last bastion of citizens to hold government accountable is the vote. And the vote creaked into action as the slow seepage of ANC voter support began. The second problem I want to raise, and we'll come back to how we resolve that in a moment. The second problem I want to raise is what people in government call silos. Customs and so-called protocols have come into practice. I discovered when I was on the board of the SABC that say that nobody with a problem, nobody who falls under one minister can go to any other minister or their department and resolve the problem without going through a lot of hoops, usually getting permission from your minister, which often doesn't come. When I was on the board of the SABC, this is just 5 years ago, the finance minister made his budget speech, and in it he made official comments about the SABC that I knew were fundamentally wrong. Well, I didn't want to go public, obviously, but I asked for a meeting between the board and the finance minister or the DG or someone. In the board, I was told, John, do you want a war? It was against protocol. I'd asked for these meetings at almost every board meeting because I knew we could iron out problems. SABC could be profitable, could have become profitable by now. I knew there were misunderstandings, a kind of broken telephone in government, but I never got that meeting. By the way, it's not unique to South Africa. When I was in the United Nations in Afghanistan, I met 3 different people in the UN system doing the same job who were quite unaware of each other. I raised it I worked under the head of the UN development program, UNDP in Afghanistan. And I said that, I met 3 guys doing the same job, but it didn't directly affect what I was doing. I said, surely you should get them all together so they could cooperate because they were doing the same sort of things and could have really multiplied the effect if they'd cooperated. He just laughed and said, silos, John, silos. He wasn't going to touch other bosses' area. This problem obviously gets worse as a country becomes more technologically advanced and complex. these protocols are obviously the opposite of good practice. The UK now has a campaign to overcome it by what they call joined up government. And that indicates that at least they understand the problem, that they face the same problem and are trying to address it. So the collapse of joint cabinet responsibility, MP accountability to constituents, and the delaying effects of silos that result in load shedding, decline in mining jobs, and rotting fruit at our ports. The next convention, which is only partly written down, is how we appoint boards in South Africa. This must change to hold them accountable. We need to look at other countries, including Africa. I think I may have mentioned in a previous session the example of Ethiopian Airways, because it's in Africa and it's such a good example. Ethiopian Airways, coming from a really poor country. I've been to Ethiopia a couple of times. It's, for those of you who know it, and obviously just reading about it, it's nothing like the size or sophistication of South Africa, and yet Ethiopian Airways has eaten South African Airways lunch. They've grown to a major airline. Last month, they bought something like 60 new jets from Airbus and Boeing. SAA is down to something like 6. I think they've just ordered another 6. So we're tiny, and they've grown from strength to strength. And for those of you who insist everything must be privatized, you'll be interested to know Ethiopian Airways is owned by the Ethiopian government. Now, some people say when I talk about all the ways you can government can support growth, that it's only possible in authoritarian countries because we're a constitutional democracy. We can't. Now, the evidence doesn't support that. The more I've read about it, it doesn't. There are various views about it, but the Ethiopian Airways is again a good example. Ethiopian Airways is far from a perfect democracy, but the reason it's successful is because the state keeps its hands off Ethiopian Airways. They did a deal, the government did a deal and said, look, we're a poor country. We can't afford an airline. It's not essential for the poor. It's not a priority for us. So we won't give you a bailout. You run out of money, you're out. On the other hand, we will ensure you put in a top-class expert board, and we won't interfere. There will be no political interference. And that's been a fantastic a recipe for success. So if Ethiopian Airways could do that in an authoritarian country and keep its hands off the airline, surely as a democracy, South Africa as a democracy should be able to do the same. So yeah. Now, the other point I want to make about board members before we change back to constitutionality is we've got to have continuity. If your board members are appointed from the best in the field, they should be expected to continue. There's been a practice where it seems that if you've had 5 years on the board, you're removed because you've had your turn, as if it's a reward. Being on a board isn't a reward. It's got to be the best person for the country. If you have good members, they should stay on longer than 5 years. And some must stay to ensure institutional memory. Often this phase breaks down. You've seen various board appointments where it breaks down. In the private sector, big company boards often have a 9-year cycle that every board has enough 9 years, which means they have enough time to acquire institutional knowledge, pass it on to others, and then leave before they become stale or cynical. So maybe 9 years is a roughly good. And this leads to another essential reform. I was friends with the authors of the Labour Relations Act when it was passed in the mid-90s. I never understood it to be intended for CEOs and senior executives on 7-figure salaries. But they use it the most. often with expensive lawyers winning on technicalities, even when you know they're guilty of doing things that were bad for the company, if not, and sometimes even illegal. I had that experience both in government when I was on the Independent Broadcasting Authority, which is a Chapter 9 body, was a Chapter 9 body. And uh, we had an issue with one of our senior executives. And when I was in private running This Day newspaper, the Nigerian newspaper in South Africa, we had the same thing. And the lawyers advised us it's cheaper to give in than to fight the case, even though we think your case is excellent or maybe even watertight. And so one other change reform that really is required is to remove senior executives from their ability to use the LRA and CCMA. It was intended for the poor to protect the poor, not the rich. I believe just that small change would surprise us in the benefits it would give to our state-owned enterprises. I think, Ibrahim, I'll stop now and see if anybody wants to say anything or ask anything, and then we'll go on to direct constitutional changes.
Thanks, John. There's quite a few comments, several, I would say, in the chat comments. There's Herman Funk and there's Rolf Pretorius, touching both on questions of electoral reform. You spoke about how people are elected, at least in the UK, in the US Congress and the House of Commons, in constituency systems where there's constituency surgeries and real constituency relations. So I'm going to give them an opportunity to say something. Rolf and Herman, if you can unmute yourself and say something. But before you do that, I just wanted to pose this question to you, John. We have what you're suggesting at local government level, right? We elect people into a constituency. And yet,
Half the municipal
sure,
council.
sure. And yet those ward councillors who are ostensibly the ones directly elected in a constituency are not playing their role. So isn't there a more fundamental representational breakdown? Don't we have a problem? It's not just so much of the nature of the system, which is bad, by the way. I will agree. But isn't our problem a more basic political culture one, in the sense that the representational interface is literally broken down? People who are purporting to represent something but are in fact not. So just that, and then Herman and Rolf, I'll give you a short ability to intervene.
Could I just ask that we hold the discussion about electoral reform till after the second, but there will be time. But just so, shall I just respond to your points before we go to more comments or questions? Yeah. So yeah, you're right about ward councillors, and I've been arguing this with the political scientists abroad, and several of them have said, "Oh, don't think the constituency system is so great," and we will come back to it. And of course, the example you cite is ward councillors, and they're not perfect. But when we get to electoral reform, I'll explain why I still support it. And the point I would make just about ward councillors, it's true there are ward councillors who are no good, but I know of quite a number of cases where the ward councillor is very hardworking, because that obviously not every ward is competitive. If it's overwhelmingly dominated by one party and they have a lock on the nomination, they can be lazy and get away with it. But in fact, the ward council system does work much better than anything else we've got on the legislature side at local, region, provincial, or national level. And I do know ward councillors who respond to calls every second of every minute of the day, respond, have relationships with officials, and come back and get things done to a degree. And we really need to encourage a culture of a new citizen oriented, public-spirited councillor to expand that.
Yeah, Herman and Rolf, if you want to say something, perhaps you can maybe save it for later when John will touch on questions of electoral reform. We can discuss it. John, related to the question of the failure of representation, right, where there is a real problem in that sense, and I think we can agree with that point, irrespective of the system that's being used. You spoke also about joined up government, about the process of working in silos, of the fact that there's no joint cabinet responsibilities. That's the words you used, right? But aren't you pointing to the fact that there is a real, apart from the fact that there is a breakdown in the representational interface, there's a real problem of accountability in government, in the sense that we are asking for a system, or we are asking people to behave in ways in which is contrary to their own political interests. So their own political interests are being translated into the administrative sphere, which means that there is no cogent relationship between the political sphere and the administrative one, because everyone uses administrative instruments to fight their own political battles. That's a political question. Which how do you solve a problem like that, other than saying, okay, we must insulate administration and executive from political interference? That's easier said than done, isn't it?
Yes. Well, successful developmental states have built up, whether it's China or Japan or Ethiopia, really work hard to build and as you know, there's a movement towards this now in South Africa, have increasingly set high professional independent exams for entry into the civil service, and they've depoliticized them. And as to your administration point, the more of that happens, the better. There are other things that are done. There's something in developmental economics called embedded. Oh, the full word will come to me later. But what it means is
embedded autonomy.
Embedded autonomy. Thanks, Abraham. And then, as you know, what that means is that in more mature economies, well, the Asian economy, right, Japan and China from early days, what they did was that a lot of the people in the civil service had a relationship with the people in the private sector. Either they went to the same, a lot of them went to the same law school. In Japan, it's common that the senior people in the civil service all went to Tokyo law faculty and studied there. They know each other. They also do exchanges with business, and you could do it with labor as well. So you have a civil servant who spends a year or two working for a company, and I wouldn't be opposed to that being with the trade union movement as well. So there's a common understanding, and this gets back to what I discussed before, but just to raise the key point of what works in terms of the state role is much in successful developmental states and rapid growth has less to do with owning state enterprises than it does to do with having equal power between the state and the private sector, which forces them to cooperate and reach market-conforming public interested policies. So both sides get what they want. And that sometimes means, and the one example I always cite is, I've been reading lately, everybody's talking again, why don't we have more beneficiation in jewelry? I've actually been asking the Minerals Council for an answer, and they've given me one, but I haven't got full satisfaction. But everything tells me that the mining companies are not going to do it because they're not jewelers. So no matter how many times the government, the state says, why don't you do more beneficiation? It doesn't work for their model. They dig big chunks of earth out of the ground. That's what they know about. But on the other hand, there are many other things. If you had a state that had embedded autonomous civil servants in it who understood the mining sector, said, okay, well, let's not waste our time on trying to force them to make jewelry when they don't know anything about it. But there are many things on the back end. When I was young, I remember driving along the East and West Rand, and there were multiple businesses that provided services to the mining sector. And as our mining sectors declined, those sectors have declined. So you could have an embedded autonomous state policy that encouraged industrialization using the mining sector, but do it in collaboration. Of course, you've got to approve licenses, both exploration and mining licenses, but the benefits would be enormous. Should we go on and just the constitution issue is not going to be very long, and then we can have a full-on discussion about it, electoral issues.
Just one thing before you go on. Are you perhaps suggesting that we have both an ossified civil service and an ossified private sector? Because, I mean, you're absolutely right. Mining companies are not in the business of beneficiation. They're in the business of digging holes in the grounds and extracting. But it's their responsibility, not responsibility, but it's their, in some ways, a responsibility and obligation to fund research and development in downstream industries. But so they ossified in that sense, that they stuck on this model that we must extract, dig and extract. And government, on the other hand, is merely just recouping the benefits of this natural resource endowment without thinking how they develop policy to incentivize the creation of other downstream industries like beneficiation or etc. I mean, you need to fund those things. They don't happen. Jewelers don't appear by magic.
Right. Well, it reminds me the perfect example of where South Africa has gone wrong is Japan. In Japan, there was a period where the state was in the negotiations. It's got nothing to do with your economic power, but in the negotiations, the state would order the private sector around, tell them, well, this is what we want, no argument. And it was a failure. The economy declined. Growth did not work well. And there was a period when the converse happened, where the private sector was holding all the cards, and they said to the state, no, this is what the private sector was, just do what we want. And that also wasn't a success, because the private sector has its strengths and weaknesses, and so does the state. The private sector's interests are sometimes in conformity with the national interest, but not always. That's why we regulate against monopolies and so on. So that's the perfect problem we have in South Africa. And of course, the debate about it here is all, private sector. Many people of their spokespeople say, privatize everything, get out of the way, leave it to us. And people in government, in the political parties and on the left say, no, the state should own it all. And from my point of view, they're talking past each other. And if you really review the literature, you look at what's worked and what hasn't, it's really, the answer is to get to a point where both go into that room knowing they don't get everything and they have to compromise. And the result is market conforming public policy. That means you don't allow a monopoly that's bad for the consumer. You encourage certain sectors that are good for the economy. I mean, for instance, one of my other hobby horses we talked about, the fourth industrial revolution. The government is right to recognize the fourth industrial revolution and AI, very important, and they'll have an impact on it. So I'm not a Luddite, I'm not saying ignore it. But the fact is the government has often spoken as if it's a great job creator, and it simply is not. I know this, I think I mentioned at one of the early meetings, we have a different crowd here. I had a TV show, and I asked the chairperson of the President's Fourth Industrial Revolution Commission, Professor Mawala, first-rate guy. I'm really sorry he's in Japan and not here now. And I said, politicians tell me that the Fourth Industrial Revolution is going to be a great thing to it. to job creation. But that's not true, is it? And his reply was emphatic. He said, "Of course not, John. It's a potential bloodbath of jobs. But of course, his job is to encourage parts of AI or IR that are beneficial. And that's why you need the government to focus on what you might call 3IR, the third industrial revolution, which we have never fixed properly. This whole issue of digital migration and all these issues that are leading to us having more expensive and slower Wi-Fi than we should have. We should be one of the cheapest in the world. In fact, we're not even cheap by African standards. Many African standard countries are cheaper than us, and some are even faster as well. So that comes from the government being forced to listen to business and to listen to experts who will tell you 4IR is going to come whether you like it or not. There's things you can do, but from a job creation perspective, they're not massive job creators, but there are massive job creation. Is your massive job creation potential if you make Wi-Fi cheaper and faster and more accessible in townships and encourage the township tech economy, which is a really growing sector and has enormous potential. Yeah, okay.
Cool. I think we can go on to the second portion around
Right.
the things. I mean, there's obviously lots of comments, but a lot of them focused on the electoral system, which you've
Okay.
opened on its nest there.
I'll just talk for about less than 10 minutes and get through it. Obviously one's hesitant to propose constitutional changes because, as I said earlier, there's always a temptation for everyone to add a pet project. But there are two that former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, who is now our judge in the Gaza case at the ICJ. Moseneke tells the story of the legendary first woman in the United States Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And when she was approached by people saying, what constitution should we use as a model? And she said, definitely not ours, not the American. The South African one is the best. That is largely true, but it evades serious discussion based on evidence. We've got to look at what has worked and what hasn't and respond to that. The Constitution is so good in part because it came after many Constitution writers had improved on the ones that came before them. The first Constitution for a democratic republic, the American one, was written in 1787. So many things have changed that make things different now. Society's changed. African needs aren't necessarily the same as America's. And also they have things like states' rights, which respond to a very specific American issue, which was really pushed at a time when the slave states were using states' rights to keep slavery. But none of them are flawless. And we saw that this week when South Africa appears to have been able to bar Jacob Zuma from running parliament because he's been convicted for contempt of court, while the US Constitution, through an anomaly really, allows Donald Trump to run for president, even if he's convicted and sitting in jail. In fact, nearly 100 years ago, a socialist candidate named Eugene Debs ran for president from jail. His conviction was arguably political, so we may applaud his ability to run, but clearly that should not be the case with someone convicted of non-political crimes. So if we avoid change is not essential to good government, what is really an urgent need to change? Well, Justice Moseneke had two priorities, which I agree with entirely. The first is our electoral system, and this is where what people have been raising. It's unfinished business. The original South African Constitution in the 90s said that the system we still use, proportional representation on the party list, was appropriate for the first election, but after that it had to be reviewed. The list system was right then for several reasons. Firstly, because we didn't have a voters' roll with all citizens registered, because under apartheid black citizens didn't vote in national elections. But there was another argument. Justice Albie Sachs, for example, still supports the current system because he argued at Cadessa and still today that with our still existing apartheid spatial separation, a constituency system, first past the post like that in the UK and the US, would lead to MPs representing one race exclusively. So you'd have Alexandra Township electing blacks and Sandton electing the whites. And his fear was that debate in Parliament would be so racialized it would become a racial slug. But I agree with Mr. I think we have to face a critical thing. We're all aware that the thousands of service delivery protests throughout the country each year. By their nature, one would expect to see the people's representatives, MPs, MPCs, town councillors, as the avenue to go to, or at least be at the service delivery protests. Most of the time, they aren't in sight. This problem is fundamental. It explains why there's so many service delivery protests. People feel they have no access to the government. In countries I've worked in with constituency systems, MPs aren't always as responsible as they should be, but they often are. And there's plenty, and there's no better, there's no better system in principle, although there's a qualification. An occasional service delivery protest is necessary, but our numbers in the tens of thousands are a sign that the constitutional system is failing them. This also relates to the way the ruling party stages protests against government policy. That's very unusual in democracy, because in a democracy, because it's almost routine. The government ruling party is protesting against itself. Now they argue that the government and the ANC operate separately, but the whole purpose of elections is to vote in a political party that will implement its policies in government. Why would you vote otherwise? So the principles for the new system should be that elected politicians are representative and proportionate. And that's what I think the Slubbert Commission achieved. And that was the recommendation. It was a recommendation that each constituency have more than one MP, the result in which the proportionality would not be lost, as it is lost in the UK, for instance, but you would gain the representativity. So if you had a constituency that included Alex and Sandton, for example, and maybe it had 3 or 4 seats elected there, I'm not sure what the exact number would be, you would still know that if you were in Alex and you'd had an Alex member there, or if you were in Sandton, you had a Sandton member of Parliament elected there, that you could go to them, and if they were uncooperative, you and your local friends could vote them out. So that's unfinished business, and the change is too important to ignore. I would argue that the first responsibility of a democratic constitution should be to ensure voters have an avenue to hold their leaders accountable, even before second generation, third generation rights, and so on. Now, Justice Mseneki's second main reform is of the president's powers. He argues that the large number of powers given at Cadessa and again in 1996 in the Vine Constitution were based on the assumption that Madiba would be president and he was trusted, so they thought that would all be fine. And what he suggests, and I agree with, is the president's powers are too great, particularly in appointing of various organizations, the Constitutional Court Chief Justice, authorizing investigations by the Special Investigations Unit, appointing the people to the Chapter 9 bodies. So that the president's power needs to be introduced. So we don't, as I say, I'm against doing too much, but I think we must face the evidence that both of these things are necessary and need to be acted on. Okay, I think we're running out of time, so let me stop there and see what people say about the electoral reform.
Thanks, John. So we're going to return to this question of electoral system reform and so on. And I don't think we need to get too technical into it, but there are both principal issues and technical issues which would come up and which do need to come up. Now, there are several people in the comments in the chat boxes which have brought up these issues. So I'm going to allow if Herman, Rolf, Neo, and Eunice, each of which have said something in the chat, if they would like the opportunity to say something, please can you unmute and just make your point quickly, please. I'll start with Herman, who's had some of the most interesting comments to make, particularly comparing with Germany. Obviously, there's problems with any kind of system that would be proposed, and we can touch on those. But Herman, if you want to unmute and just say what your issues were.
Thank you very much, both to John and Ephraim. By the way, you wanted us to show our face, but the message is that I cannot start the video, so I'll
That's
have to
okay.
be okay. I've been living in South Africa for nearly 50 years, and unfortunately, even though I'm a bit of a political animal, in other words, I'm interested in politics, I'm interested in what's going on in society, I'm actually quite actively engaged in social change myself. The one disadvantage I have, I'm German born and still have a German passport, therefore I'm not allowed to vote in South Africa, which I regret, but there's nothing I can do about it except contribute to conversations such as today. And yeah, I think as long as we vote for nameless lists, as long as voters have only the opportunity to vote for nameless lists, then the mess we are in will not change, in my personal opinion. And we drew a comparison to the ward councillors who are voted for through the constitutional system, which I think, and I agree with John there, a lot of them are very hardworking. I mean, I live in a community where the opposition councillors are the ones who keep the community informed and alive. So it does work. But also, I think needs to be, even if we would go to a mixed system like we have in Germany, or even to a totally system where a direct vote, the voters vote directly for the various parliamentarians, it would still be necessary that the members of parliament or any politician has the right to live up and how should I say, live up to his own or her own consciousness, which right now is not possible. If my conscience tells me something different to party line, I'm in trouble. So that also needs to be, we need a culture change here as well, in my personal opinion. And I made a little remark about a book by Professor Henry Mintzberg, Rebalancing Society, and I really highly recommend it. It's easy to read, it's really available, and I think South Africans could learn a lot. And Ibrahim, I've got one problem. Defend our democracy. Is it really exposed enough to have an impact? I mean, there are 47 participants here today. There should be a couple of thousand, again, in my opinion. So these are things we need to discuss. And again, it requires a culture change. Thank you.
Thanks, Herman. Rolf? While we're waiting for Rolf, and if he can make it, there's a comment, John, about the topic of today. Are we straight from the topic? I'm not sure that we have.
Can I respond to that? Rahana Hussa asked,
Yeah.
she thought the subject of today was 4 global trends, tailor-made to create Southern. jobs. Why didn't we discuss it, and will we discuss it again? In fact, Rahana, we discussed it at the last webinar, the third one, and you should be able to get that off the Facebook page and the old version. And this one was really following up on saying, now that we know how to create the jobs, what are the government's impediments? So that's why this one was more about these government issues. But please go back to that one if you get a chance. I think it's quite important. And in fact, my book, Sewell's Choices, was really on exactly that subject. Go ahead, Rolf.
Okay. I hope you can all hear me. The one thing that I wanted to highlight is that there is a difference between the first past the post system as the local ward system is, and also the old South African system, and what's going on in England and the United States, where in each constituency there's only one representative being elected. Because in a strong party system like we have, effectively then that candidate is appointed by the political party, and because people tend to vote according to political parties, that the dominant political party effectively still appoints the public representative. Now, this is exactly why so many of us are supporting this Salbert system, because it's a multi-seat configuration, and the nature of our politics nowadays is such that because there is a minimum of 3 members of parliament that will be elected from every constituency, it's highly unlikely that all 3 of those MPs will be selected from the same party. At the moment that one of the candidates of a political party will fall out, then provided that the lists are open, in other words, that the voters vote against the name of the public representatives, then at least one of them will fall out. So this forces them to actually also campaign against each other. And so if effectively this makes it an election of individual candidates and not one of political parties. So also then not only can you still vote for the same political party, but you now vote for another candidate of that party. But also it puts all the party candidates and the independent candidates on the same footing, basically. So this actually forces the whole of society to start to vote for individuals, and I've been studying it on the internet. The one aspect of these systems is that everywhere it forces these candidates to go into the communities, to go and sit with the people in their houses and to talk about them, about their personal circumstances, something that doesn't happen at the moment.
Thanks, Rolf. Neo and Eunice.
Hi, good morning. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you. I think mine is just a simple one. There's 2 levels as far as I'm concerned. What we're talking about, obviously, which is important, is the system, the governance system, how to change it. And one has to look into, obviously, it's the number issue. The majority party in parliament is the majority party in government. So for anything to happen at that level, obviously you need to have sort of a majority. In this case, I made an example in my comment that you can only get to that once you have a simple majority from one organization. In our case, could be a collective, what you call a coalition. That's just one. 2, have we reached a political maturity in terms of local, where we are, the voters? It's very interesting for me to understand what are the people voting for. I know they're voting for whatever party, whatever, but 30 years later, are we at the point where we can talk about other things, the governance? Do people on the ground understand what we're talking about? And how do we get them to that level? Because yes, we can talk and talk. We clearly need that, but ultimately it's people who vote on the ground. Have they reached a level where it's no longer about one particular issue, but it's core issues of governance, which, by the way, has an impact on their lives? Thank you.
Thanks. Eunice had a point about recall. Eunice? No, okay. I mean, look, there's some good points.
Eunice is there.
Okay,
yes,
there we go.
Yes,
Eunice.
thank you so much. I was just unable to unmute. I was just raising what I think is a small point about recall. I think that once public office bearers are elected, I think a comfort zone develops, and largely they feel protected by the political parties that they represent. And unless their parties deal with underperformance, it's almost impossible for the electorate to deal with underperformance. So a system of recall, I think, would certainly help to develop a better culture. I guess a system of recall is possible and doable at local level. It might be much harder at a provincial and national level. I mean, if a president underperforms, I don't think it's going to be easy to have a system of recall, but I don't think it's impossible either. So I think for greater accountability and for better performance, a system of recall would certainly help us in some ways. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Yes, thanks. Well, I made some notes and I've got some responses to all the issues raised, and they sort of meld together some of them. The first comment was, one of those comments was about the culture, whether our culture is, the political culture is failing us. I'm of the view that the political culture follows the electoral system. And I have the confidence that voters will vote if they think their vote matters. That's why, the first elections here, and as I saw in Afghanistan, everybody wants to vote. They have such a belief in it. The support goes down for a number of reasons, but among them is that people, if you see it anecdotally, if you talk to people, why aren't you voting? They say, why should we bother? It doesn't change anything. If you have a direct MP that you voted for, MPC, and you go to them with problems and they solve them, you'll want to vote again. If they don't solve them, you'll want to vote against them again. So I think you've got to change the policy. The electoral system. This links to some of the other questions. If you remember when Thabo Mbeki was president, they introduced the floor crossing to allow people who'd been elected on a party list to change parties. And I always thought that was unfortunate because they weren't elected as individuals. But if you're elected as an individual and your party becomes corrupted or something, you should be able to cross the floor because you are validly elected. It wasn't your party that was elected, it was you by name. And so I think if you have this system, you can introduce floor crossing. Before I go to a rules point about how you get this done, I want to just raise another point about the system. I'm inclined to agree with most of you that the Slavitt Commission plan of multi-party constituencies is about the best. There is one other piece to it. I can't remember if Slavitt used this, so you may have, which is that you can also allow people you use the system called single transferable vote, which means if you're voting in a constituency and there are 3 slots and 4 people and 5 people are running, and you vote for the one that comes 5th, your second choice can be brought in to replace it. And that works successfully in some countries. But again, it's got to be done right, because I can tell you, just of interest, in Afghanistan, we had the very worst system. We had something called single non-transferable, and that meant that in effect, you could have a perfectly run election and get a very undemocratic outcome, because you had the constituency effectively was an entire province. In the case of Kabul, for instance, there were 33 MPs. So the first person might get 80% of the votes, and number 33 might get 3% of votes. They each have 1 seat. And that was very undemocratic in my view. And I must tell you, I was acting head of the UN election project, and I had interactions with some of the most senior people in the United States government. And they were not aware in Washington that we were using such a bad system. Many of the top people, decision makers that I met with, were totally unaware of it. So it really does matter which system you use. And then as to Rolf's question, this is an interesting question. How do you get it done? Well, the truth is that, before I get into that, the first point is that under our current system, effectively, as you've described, you're a party appointee, which means in a way you often owe your seat to your president, 1 or 2 top people in the leadership. So that's who you feel accountable to. So that's how the bad culture is created by the system. So if you know all you have to do is satisfy the leader of your party, you're going to focus on that much more than satisfying your constituents. And you won't feel the pressure to do that right. Now, what's happening in 2024, I think, without getting into taking sides in the politics, I think now, with Jacob Zuma running a campaign, which I think will be certainly get some votes, at least in KZN, and then some, couple of votes here and there for Esmat Shula and Hlaudi Motsoeneng and others, and all these other parties. The IFP is growing. Action South Africa, you've got Zungeza Zibi's Mzansi party. I think with all of that, it's pretty clear the ANC is now, I think, likely to go below 50, which means that somebody in the opposition, if it's 49, not much changes, because they'll just invite one or 2 MPs to join them. Without offering them very much, because there'll probably be a queue of people away. But if they get lower than that and they need to go in with a major opposition party, this is why this conversation today is important, because we as voters need to be telling the opposition parties that when you go in, you have to have a plan for that already. You have to be able to go into that meeting with whoever the coalition partners are, and say, to get a Slabbert Commission version or some other version that does allow for accountability, constituency system, we have to demand it going in. Because once you're in the government, I think it's probably too late. So it's going to be key what people are prepared for in the opposition parties. And when they go into those negotiations, what they're prepared to fight for and what they're prepared to make a red line over. That's all I have. I think that covers everything. Oh, on the recall, sorry, Eunice raised the question about recall. Obviously, it's a good idea, because you do want to be able to have voter power to remove the candidate. But in California, where they've done it, sometimes it works out well and sometimes it works out badly. So I'd want to look at the fine print on a recall policy. But I certainly think the key thing is if we introduced a constituency system that has a built-in recall function in it, in a way that the current system doesn't.
That's true, but I mean, all of these sound absolutely fantastic in theory, but you have to think about the administrative cost and the administrative implications, particularly of things like a recall.
Yes.
A recall, I mean, like many other things, they can be horrendously administratively involved and expensive because of the threshold required to recall. It's basically running another mini election, so to speak. So that's not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying we've got to think through those other implications. Same is true for things like multi-member constituency systems. I mean, if the reality is you want more accountability, multi-member constituency systems often allow for the evasion of accountability because one representative merely shifts the blame onto another in that region. So you got to go for something really clean. And then things like single transferable vote, they're fantastic in the sense that they are balancing all these requirements. You can choose the individual can come from a party, you're choosing multiple people, they are in a constituency. But can you imagine the statistic? Because it's all rank ordered, right? You are rank ordering voting. So the results tabulation becomes incredibly statistically complex. And votes have to be transferred and cross-transferred to other people. And the outcome can not always be terribly fair, but it is also just so difficult to administer. And the integrity of it, the oversight systems required for it, become incredibly complex. So there's a lot of fantastic systems which balance proportionality with everything else, but the costs, the complications, the requirements required to run such systems administratively and otherwise are also important. I mean, just to the point of Rehan, where sure, we were supposed to talk about the 4 global trends, and it is in the second series, but the reason why these system discussions are so important is because they go to the heart of two of the issues that John spoke about. The first that John spoke about was the question of joined up government, cabinet responsibility, and the nature of the electoral system determines how that cabinet is eventually not just composed, but who they're going to be accountable to and how they're going to be accountable. So if you want cabinet accountability, the question of electoral system is just as important if cabinet accountability is necessary for sagacious policy implementation, etc. But lots to think about. We still have a couple minutes before we schedule to close. If there are any other comments related both to the issues brought up in previous seminars on the relationship between democracy and development, we spoke about the 4IR and whether that and artificial intelligence is going to be a major kind of job creating driver. We had other discussions about the nature of policy. We spoke about the kind of areas in which if there's policy changes, we can fast track job creation and so on. If there are comments largely around any of those issues, we're happy to take them. We have a couple of minutes. I see Herman has raised his hand again. If there's anyone else, Herman, I'd like to give someone else an opportunity to talk. That's not to preclude you from doing so, but if there are any other comments, I'd like them to also make an intervention. If not, Herman, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I think one thing is clear, and the conversation today has confirmed that as well. Democracy is not restricted to voting. Democracy needs a very active citizenship. Just to give you an example, they had to close a demonstration in Hamburg yesterday or the day before against we have a right-wing party which makes more and more noise in Germany. And they expected, let's say, 10,000 people to demonstrate. And in actual fact, eventually 50 or 80,000 people pitched up. They couldn't kind of manage that. But the point I want to make is these are the kind of participations we need. Unfortunately, in this country, so far, it's been the poorest of the poor who have expressed their opinions, very often violently, which is understandable, considering that they've been suppressed for generations. But for example, there are no peaceful, powerful demonstration by the middle class. It's totally missing in South Africa. So we need to, and that's also, John, what I meant with cultural change. We need to make people aware that democracy is not a vote every 5 years. It's a lot more. And we would all benefit if we engage. Thank you.
Thanks, Herman. Just also to remind everyone about the polis link, which is in the chat. I think it will be posted again by Defend Our Democracy, which will be posted in the chat. The question which is being posed on that is listed there, but the basic nub of the question is, what can South Africa do to change? What is required? And so the nub of the question is, what changes are needed to turn South Africa from a state which is showing signs of failure into a successful state? So please try and interact with that link. Any final comments from anyone of the participants before I allow John to make his concluding remarks and so on? John?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, well, the one point I want to make in closing is that the electoral change, I think, is essential to save democracy. Democracy is at risk in many countries in the world, as we know. We're actually seeing democratic decline around the world, including in Africa. And the fact that the ordinary voter is being turned off, I don't know if you saw there was a survey that said something like 72% of South Africans no longer believe in democracy and would prefer a sort of benign dictator or something like that. Well, that's a very serious thing, because maybe you get one benign dictator and then you get a very malignant one. And the fact that voters are being so turned off and that the system is failing so bad makes a change essential. And I think even if it costs more money or whatever, this simple change to a constituency system, probably multi-party, so that people are so that the proportionality is retained. I think that's vital and essential. But of course, for it to happen, the voters have got to make the political parties understand that it's a priority.
Sure, we do. You know that the current electoral legislation mandates that the minister has to appoint a panel looking at long-term electoral reform, long-term electoral review. So let's see what happens to that process. It was started, but the parliamentary committee kicked it back for reopening because they were unhappy with the gender and racial and age, especially age and gender composition of the proposed panel. So that process will restart, and let's see what will happen. So that is on the agenda. But, political parties, being the beast that they are, will likely want to devise a system that will be beneficial to them, which is precisely what they did after the Constitutional Court finding in 2020. So perhaps one of the best ways of doing this is to actually hold a referendum. The problem with this is that the electoral system debates and details can get so arcane that it's difficult to start to follow, because people conflate the principal issues with the technical issues and so on. But anyway, Defend Our Democracy is going to do stuff in relation to the 2024 elections. They will be doing an observer mission and a bunch of other citizen observation and so on. Please keep a lookout for those details. Details for the next seminar will be advertised soon. As I said, the polis interactive discussion that they would like to foster, the link is posted on there. John, thank you very much again for this, everyone for attending this morning. It's a Saturday morning. Hopefully we're not going to, go on for too long. This one was good, short, sharp, to the point, well within time. Thanks everyone, and thanks again, Defend Our Democracy and the team at Defend Our Democracy, Chetza, Renee, Zinzi, and Zakira for hosting this and making it possible. And again, thanks John, thanks to you, and thanks to everyone. See you guys at the next one. Look out for the details of that. Yes,
Thank you.
Herman, you can
Thanks,
invite anyone to participate in the poll. It's meant to be an open discussion. So great. Thanks, everyone. See you guys at the next one. Defend Our Democracy. Please note some of the comments around the link and the registration details, particularly made by Ms. Muller about the link and so on, and the advert. But hopefully we'll see you at the next one. It was the first one. I do think that the participation wasn't too bad, close to 50. Thanks for a great, useful session. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
So see you guys all at the next one. Thanks very much. Thanks, John.
Yeah.